Hey, how's it going? Tough crowd, okay. Hi, so I'm Martina Huynh. I'm a design researcher, and my talk is split in two parts. So the first part gives a bit of an overall reflection on the importance of having technologies inscribe a very different set of values, like what could alternative technologies be, and what are the political implications of that. Yes, thank you. And so the second part is a slightly more performative narration of my project Living Infrastructure that hopefully exemplifies what I mean in part one. All right, part one. All designs and objects have distinct values embedded in them. And we know that from, for instance, how a product is produced, whether it's fair trade, whether design is particularly child-friendly, for instance, like this insulin kit for children with type 1 diabetes. And this has been particularly visible in the field of architecture, where buildings are built for an ideal society, like for which ideal society is a building built, or what kind of building arrangements are aspired to create an ideal society. So the same applies to digital technologies, where you see in the commercials the perfect world in which a product is supposed to be placed in. So if we take Apple, for example, with their commercials, they try to be very cool, young, hip, global, creative, sleek, expensive, and which differs quite a bit from the reality of how it's produced, which we all know, and also which differs quite a bit from the reality of actually owning one of their devices, where the vision is quite clearly that per design you're not supposed to open it up, have a look, repair it, upgrade it, or do anything to it. So do you really own it? I'm not quite sure. I also have an Apple product. So it comes at no surprise that a maker movement has steadily evolved in recent decades and strengthened, because people have this need to understand, to open up, to make and feel empowered. Of course, this is not a direct reaction to Apple as a company, but more to the growing complexities of the devices that we surround ourselves with. And in a way, it's sobering to see how these visions of the future ended up looking just the same as always. We still sit on couches, we still have wooden tables, strange vases, books still exist, with the only addition being a weird augmented loudspeaker that talks back to you. And we see from its design that it's trying to look very inoffensive, not to scare people off, and to not raise attention to how it's quite a bit more potent and invasive than any of the surrounding objects, although it's trying very hard to hide behind the vase and try not to look all too different from that, although it is. Now, design of technologies also manifest themselves in the design of the interface, which is often where the relation between user and object is defined. Siri, with a smooth female voice, is of course associated to an obedient daily assistant who never gets upset at you. I heard someone laughing. A friend of mine just recently mentioned how she found herself in this very strange situation of bossing Siri around, although she never had a servant or maid, and then so she was a bit surprised at this new behavior or this new side that came out of her. Now, much has been written about the use of female voices in today's devices, but did you know that in the beginning of Apple's voice assistant back in the late 80s, Siri was supposed to have a deep male voice because it was supposed to remind you of, speaking to an all-knowing white male professor who was always ready to give you the capital city of whatever country comes to your mind. This gentleman has nothing to do with this, but he looks exactly like I imagined this. Thank you. So digital technologies, the way they are and look today, were designed by people and could have been different from how they are now. But somehow they are so present, and it's hard to imagine that. It's hard to imagine that digital technologies, the way they are now, are not natural nor neutral. Perhaps that's why it's so fascinating to see how, for instance, more mobile phone alternatives are trying to make it to the market. Here an example.
If how we spend our days is always connected, staring at our screens, well, that would be how we spend the rest of our lives. You see, as humans, we are vulnerable, and our smartphones are engineered to use these vulnerabilities against us.
This is why we've intentionally designed a phone to be used as little as possible.
So what's interesting is how they're addressing the norms promoted by the devices and platforms we use and propose to make a different phone that only offers the very most essential features. So that's Light Phone 2. Block Phone does something similar by not reducing the features, but trying to keep its visual interface as minimalistic and non-distracting as possible. So many people would say, why not simply use a dumb phone? Which I think is a very good point. There should be not just one or two alternatives, but there should be many. There should be many alternative mobile phones and corresponding lifestyles. There should be many alternative computer operating systems that distinguish themselves from the handful and very similar ones that we already are familiar with. So instead of saying technology is neither good nor bad, it depends on how it's being used, we might want to constructively discuss how do we want technology to work for us, and what social values should this innovation represent? In times when location-based navigation services and things like Google search engine have become such integral to the functioning of our daily lives, so much they could be considered a digital infrastructure, it kind of baffles me that we have no say in how they work for us. Of course, they are a private company, but there are days in which my search results might change the course of my day more, or might affect that day of my life more than the country I live in or the country I come from. So being openly addressed as users rather than citizens with a democratic say makes it difficult to negotiate the terms and conditions we are presented with on a daily basis. So as an example, my project Augmented Mundanity OS is a humble take on designing interfaces that make it easier for the user to take back a little bit of control in regard to privacy. There are 3 elements to it. So let's say these are my recommendations. Somehow they're leaking onto another screen. Me looking critically. So there are 3 objects in this project. So one is a curtain. When you use the curtain for more privacy, you also change your regular browser to Tor browser for an encrypted browsing experience. See that metaphor? The second object is a room spray, that when you use it, you're also masking your real whereabouts and change your IP address via a VPN so no one can sniff you out or sniff out your real identity. And so the last thing in the series. So that's a cloth that when you come close to the screen, and because you need to wipe the dust sometimes, I guess, then it also automatically clears your cache cookie and browser history, as if you're physically wiping the data from within your browser. So by connecting these existing digital defense mechanisms with metaphoric routine actions, I wanted to make it easier for the user to also reach into and affect the network environment, as well as protecting themselves. Now, when we talk about visions and future concepts for emergent technologies in art and design, we mostly encounter many thought-provoking concepts and ideas, but unfortunately with a bit of a dystopian spin, telling very critical, cautionary tales of where we should not go with our technologies. And that is very important and great for facilitating discussions, and we should have these. But I think also by making these undesirable visions concrete, giving them shape, and sharing this outlook also slowly manifests them in our own reality. It seems much more difficult to come up with desirable alternatives of how now could be different. That is neither a Black Mirror apocalypse nor a Happy Apple commercial, but something actually radically different. So in living infrastructure, I tried to imagine how basic cable networks would be like if our surrounding ecologies were taken into the set of values that created them, and how this might be sort of within touching distance. Oh, sorry, part 2. Change of voice. Imagine if we were to work closely with another species, link our information system with theirs, exchange goods and services to mutual benefit. That kind of system already exists, just not between us and other species, but between plants and mushrooms. Some types of fungi form mycelium. They are little hair-like tubes that branch out in search of food, creating a network-like structure. You could compare them to roots. Some types of mycelium form a bond with plant roots, where they extend the plant's reach for nutrients. And this symbiotic association is referred to as mycorrhizal. Because plants are better at producing carbon from photosynthesis, and mushrooms are better at getting phosphorus and other minerals from the soil, sometimes directly mining them from rocks, they specialize and eventually also trade. Researchers at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam found out that there's a whole market dynamics going on. So, for instance, if the phosphorus gets scarce in the soil, it also becomes more expensive, so it's being traded for more carbon, and the other way around. It's quite fascinating. Mycorrhiza can connect entire forests, creating a complex social network. You might have heard about its corny nickname of the Wood Wide Web. Research has shown that trees are able to communicate with each other by sending warning signals. So, for instance, if a forest gets under attack by a malicious beetle or a fire on one side, they can, through the fungal highway underground, they can warn the other trees, so they brace themselves already with defense mechanisms. Defense chemicals, which is a mechanism. Mycorrhizal networks also facilitate the exchange of nutrients between individual trees. Sometimes a nutrient-rich tree might donate some of its nutrients to a nutrient-poorer tree through the mycorrhizal network connection. So you can think of it like a forest welfare system. This is a beautifully dynamic infrastructure that exists already below the ground. It is alive, able to evolve, and adapt to its environment. Now, how does our network infrastructure look like? For electricity and internet, we have cables. We dig out some ground every time we place and replace them, casually disturbing the natural ecosystem in the soil. And these cables still remain an isolated piece of human technology that have no relation to its surroundings. When we do this, we tend to work against rather than with the landscape. And we even wrap these wires in layers and layers of isolation to shield them from what's around, be it soil or water. If only our cables were able to relate to and tap into the abundant systems they're embedded in, we could have a biologically augmented type of network. Therefore, I propose that we merge our both systems and let these mycorrhizal networks teach us to form a new partnership by joining our human cable network with mycelium networks. Just imagine if our infrastructure were actually a living organism that can grow, adapt, and maintain itself. A common notion is that technology and nature lie on two opposite sides. Can we not break this binary view on technology versus nature? Especially with the rise of synthetic biologies and other technologies at hand, we might see how this engineered life and our machines might become living machines. Oh, that's another slide. They will be able to integrate much better with the environment than any other of our inanimate technologies. And we must be careful not to treat them like machines that we simply use, but to see them as partners to work with. Because placing ourselves on equal level as other species is where I see a new way forward, a mindset, an attitude that is fit for an era after and past the human-centric mindset that helped shape the Anthropocene. But the current vision of the future is not one of interspecies collaborations, but looks much more like this. The smart city, where everything is tailored to man and nature only invited in if its elements are 100% under control, if it cannot be itself anymore. Isn't the point of smart to create something that works well on its own? Instead of working on making humanoid robots with citizenship or attempting to make perfect cybernetic feedback loops of exactly all the right data sets and perfect correlations to improve our cities, wouldn't it make sense to collaborate with a system that is already autonomous? Rather than focusing on smart, we could be striving for living infrastructure instead. Now, so what's next? How can this be achieved? First, we need the willingness as humans to understand the fungus. For me, it all started out with a few very small experiments where I was trying to get to know the mycelium better as a material, but also as a living organism. I was growing oyster mushrooms and found that mycelium is conductive. Oh, wait. Oh, okay, not playing. Anyways, so this is not mycelium, this is an enoki mushroom, but I was using it as a kind of volume switcher or potentiometer just by the distance of the two things. Oh, okay, sorry. I mean, of course, it's just the changing resistance. But I still thought it was quite nice. This was my attempt to use mushrooms as an antenna for a radio station. Of course, it didn't work. And mushrooms also generate small amounts of electricity, which these guys at around the same time have been much further at figuring that out, which gave me hope. So I wasn't completely off track. I put some champignons between the 4 pins of a ultrasonic proximity sensor. It didn't change the values that were read out, so I guess you could say mushrooms can transmit information in a very basic sense. Other experiments included me trying to grow mycelium under low current to see whether it mines. I guess it does. Or growing mycelium in heavy metal contaminated soil that I got from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, hoping it would take up some copper and zinc and improve its conductivity. Also tried that with graphite. The experiments are not very conclusive because it started to mold. But there is research about multiple types of mycelia that do absorb and sequester heavy metals from polluted waters, and they just take it up. It doesn't seem to affect their health. Whether it affects their conductivity is still something to be explored. I guess my biggest success in this series of experimentations is, so this is just a mycelium growth bag. So again, I was trying to do the battery thing, and I was thinking, oh, it would be so great to have wireless electricity, and then to think back of these dreams of Nikola Tesla, because there's soil everywhere underneath our feet, and probably there's some mycelium growing there. So if we imagine just free electricity being emitted into the air that is just up for grabs, that would be great. So this is a very terrible video, but in the end you will see that the LED blinks a little bit. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, okay, we've seen enough. So my dialogue with the fungus was limited to me doing something to it and seeing how it would react, which is still very crude. But if we want to work together, we need to find better ways to communicate with fungi. And that's why we need to invent devices able to interpret the bioelectric and biochemical signals present in the mycelium. By finding a common ground, we will be able to listen in to what it is that the fungi wants and care for its needs as well. Instead of forcing it to do anything, we will probably have to entice the mycelium to grow where we want it to grow and to care for its surroundings and create favorable conditions in order for it to grow well. We need to be open for its input and make compromises, adapt our tech by lowering the voltage level and current draw. If our devices can become faster and smaller every year, I'm sure they can be made to run on lower voltage like USB connections, Raspberry Pis, and smartphones already do. At the same time, we want to select and breed a mycelium for the perfect mycelium for desirable network properties. By enhancing it with our technologies, we will help it to spread and become a very successful species. Mycelium can be bred to do many things, like it's being done already at Utrecht University for material properties. It can be bred for other things as well, through selection. I think by being considerate with each other and working towards a common goal of building this infrastructure, we can explore and approach this new interspecies relation step by step. And we can do this. I alone can't do this. I can just make a humble start. We need people who have the specific knowledge and the means to do it. We need scientists, philosophers, educators, investors, critical voices to engage in and think more about such interspecific partnerships. Instead of keeping ourselves busy with old modernist utopias like the smart city, can we move on to living to different modalities of living together with our surrounding ecologies? It will become evident how we are supported by living systems and how we, as part of this, also have our responsibilities and duties. Will large corporations treat the environment differently if their infrastructure depended on nature so directly? To view natural systems on a more equal level requires us to give up zone control, to leave unexpected things to happen. Let the system evolve naturally with us, not just for sustainable, but for much more resilient infrastructure. And so I know this may not be implementable in exactly this way, because my vision is still phrased by a human. At times, the mycelium will not agree with us, and we will have to follow its path instead. And I guess that's fine. Perhaps what I'm proposing is not implementable on this scale. But before we dismiss this idea as too ambitious, I would first need to see enough effort invested in trying, because I can promise that just the pursuit of this direction of thought is a worthwhile journey to take on. Because learning how to work together with fungi is a first step to define a more symbiotic relation between man, technology, and nature. Thank you.